The silence in the Seoul boardroom was heavy enough to crush bone. Kang Min-jae stood at the head of the mahogany table, his gaze fixed on the far wall, his posture rigid. Across from him, the woman who had served as his secretary for 3 years was shaking. Her breathing came in ragged, uneven gasps that echoed against the glass walls. She gathered her things with trembling hands, dropping a pen, then a notebook, then a folder. She did not bother to pick them up. She turned and fled, the heavy door clicking shut behind her with a finality that signaled the end of her career. Min-jae did not turn his head. He did not watch her leave. He stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the empty chair where she had sat only moments ago. The air in the room remained stagnant, untouched by the emotional outburst. He was a man who measured success in margins and efficiency, and to him, the tears were merely a sign of a failed investment. He was entirely alone in the center of his empire, and he preferred it that way. Min-jae finally moved. He turned away from the empty chair and paced toward the floor-to-ceiling glass, his reflection ghosting over the city lights below. His deputy stood by the door, clutching a tablet, waiting for a signal. Min-jae did not look back. He gestured vaguely toward the exit, his hands slicing through the air with surgical precision. He spoke, his voice devoid of inflection. "Find someone who does not tremble when I speak," he said. He paused, his eyes narrowing as he watched a helicopter bank. "I do not pay for nerves. I do not pay for hesitation. I require an extension of my own will, not a witness to my temperament." He tapped the glass, a sharp, rhythmic sound that cut through the low hum of the office ventilation. "The next one will be different. They will be efficient, they will be silent, and they will be entirely replaceable. Bring me a machine that can take dictation." He turned back to the table, his expression as blank as the polished surface of the wood, waiting for the deputy to execute the command. Miles away from the sterile silence of the boardroom, Alice Johnson stood on the sidewalk, dwarfed by the sheer scale of the glass tower. The wind whipped around the corners of the building, tugging at her hair, but she remained still. She reached up to smooth her blouse, her fingers lingering for a second to steady her breathing. Her pulse thrummed against her throat, a rhythmic, insistent beat that mirrored the frantic pace of her thoughts. She had spent her final savings on the transit fare and the small, worn portfolio tucked under her arm. Every cent she possessed was tied to the outcome of the next hour. She looked up at the reflective surface of the building, seeing a distorted version of herself staring back. She adjusted her hair, pulling the strands back into a tighter, more disciplined shape. The lobby doors stood ahead, a threshold between her current struggle and the possibility of a new life. She took a long, deep breath, tasting the metallic tang of the city air, and forced her hands to stop shaking. She was not just here for a job, she was here to survive. With a final, sharp nod to her own reflection, she stepped forward, the heavy glass door swinging open to swallow her into the lobby. Alice stepped into the elevator, the heavy doors sliding shut with a soft, final thud. Before we continue, kindly subscribe and share this channel. With this gesture, it helps for more stories. The interior was a brushed metal cage, cool to the touch and unnervingly quiet. As the lift surged upward, the sudden shift in gravity pressed the soles of her feet against the floor. She watched the floor numbers climb in a steady, glowing sequence. Her reflection flickered in the polished wall panels, showing a face that looked smaller and more fragile. She gripped the leather portfolio until her knuckles turned white, the texture of the worn material grounding her. The elevator hummed, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to resonate in her chest, matching her heartbeat. A chime echoed through the shaft. The doors began to slide open, revealing the long hallway. The elevator doors fully retracted, spilling Alice into a corridor that felt stripped of all life. The carpet was thick, muffling her footsteps until every movement sounded like a transgression. She walked forward, the hallway stretching out like a vein, leading to the center of the tower. The air here was different, colder, filtered, and devoid of the city's hum. She reached the heavy double doors of the office and paused, her hand hovering over the cold metal handle. She pushed. The door swung open with a silent, hydraulic ease. Inside, the space was vast, dominated by a wall of floor-to-ceiling glass that framed the dark, rainy skyline of Seoul. The room felt thin, as if the oxygen had been carefully rationed. Min-jae stood at the far end, his back to her, a silhouette against the city lights. He did not turn. He did not acknowledge her presence. The silence in the room was not empty. It was heavy, pressing against her ears. Alice took a step inside, the door clicking shut behind her. She took a tentative step forward, her eyes fixed on the back of the man standing by the glass. The rug beneath her feet was thick, a deep pile surface that snagged the toe of her shoe with unexpected resistance. Her momentum betrayed her. She lurched forward, arms windmilling in a desperate, failed attempt to regain her center of gravity. She hit the floor hard, the impact jarring her teeth. The leather portfolio slipped from her grip, its metal clasp snapping open upon contact with the polished floorboards. Papers erupted from the interior, sliding across the room like white leaves caught in a sudden gust. They fanned out across the dark, expensive wood, a chaotic mess of ink and edges that stood out against the sterile perfection of the office. Alice scrambled to her knees, her breath coming in short, sharp hitches. She reached for the nearest sheet, but her fingers shook, causing her to fumble the grip. Every movement felt amplified in the unnatural quiet. She stayed there, hunched over the scattered remains. Alice lunged for a stray document near the edge of the mahogany table. She pushed herself up, her knee catching the leg of a rolling service cart she had not seen in the shadows. The cart shuddered. A porcelain cup, filled to the brim with steaming espresso, tipped over the edge. It struck the floor with a sharp, hollow crack, but the liquid followed a different path. It splashed upward, a dark, hot arc that landed squarely against the center of Min-jae's chest. The dark stain bloomed instantly, spreading across the fabric like ink on a canvas. Alice gasped, her hands flying out to catch the falling cup, but she only succeeded in knocking the saucer into the base of the table. The clatter echoed, dying away into a vacuum of sound. She remained on her hands and knees, her gaze locked on the spreading heat on his torso. The air in the room seemed to vanish. She did not dare to breathe. She looked up, expecting the sharp, cold reprimand of a man whose world had just been violated by her chaos. The room held its breath, the silence now so absolute it felt like a physical weight. Alice braced for the shout. She tightened her muscles, waiting for the inevitable command to leave. Instead, the man simply looked down at the dark, spreading mark on his torso. He did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He let out a long, slow breath that seemed to deflate his entire frame. It was not the sound of anger, but of profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He looked back at her, his eyes scanning her face, noting the way her fingers trembled against the floorboards. The silence stretched, but the sharp edge of it had dulled. He shifted his weight, the movement slow and deliberate, and gestured toward the mess. "Clean it up," he said, his voice barely rising above a whisper. The words were flat, devoid of the venom she had anticipated. Alice blinked, her mind struggling to reconcile the reality of his calm with the disaster she had caused. She reached for a napkin, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. He stood perfectly still, watching the ceiling, as if the stain were a triviality that barely registered in his day. She worked in silence. The days bled into one another, each marked by a new, avoidable error. Alice moved through the office with a frantic energy that rarely resulted in precision. She dropped a stack of quarterly reports, the papers sliding across the polished floor like fallen leaves. She mispronounced the names of high-profile clients during conference calls, her voice wavering under the weight of her own nerves. Each time she flinched, waiting for the inevitable letter of termination to land on her desk. She braced for the cold, sharp dismissal that had claimed her predecessors. It never came. Min-jae would simply look away, his gaze shifting toward the window or the stack of files on his desk. He never raised his voice. He never sighed with the same weary intensity as the day of the spill. He just returned to his work, his focus absolute and unyielding. The office became a landscape of her small, persistent failures and his silent, inexplicable endurance. She would stand in the doorway, clutching a misfiled folder, watching him. Why was she still there? She continued to stumble, and he continued to watch, neither of them acknowledging the strange, fragile routine they had built. The final straw arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. Alice reached for the door handle, intending to pull it shut as she left for a courier run. Her thumb slipped, hitting the override button for the electronic security system. With a sharp, mechanical click, the heavy door slammed shut and the deadbolt engaged. Min-jae was inside. She was outside. The office was now a fortress, and the CEO was trapped behind his own reinforced glass. Alice stood frozen, her hands still pressed against the cold panel. Her stomach dropped. This was not a drop file or a mispronounced name. This was a total operational failure. She scrambled to find the master key, her fingers fumbling against the wall-mounted keypad, But the system had entered a lockout mode. She waited for the door to burst open, for the sound of his voice cutting through the hallway, for the final, absolute end of her employment. 5 minutes passed, 10. Then a muffled sound came from within the steady, rhythmic tapping of a keyboard. Min-jae had not shouted. Alice leaned her forehead against the door, the silence from the other side more terrifying than any scream could have been. Alice spent the following days watching him. She tracked the way he moved, the way he looked at his screens, and the way he navigated the office. The fear that had defined her first weeks began to transform into a sharp, persistent curiosity. She started to leave minor tasks incomplete just to see if the expected reprimand would finally surface. She left a stack of memos unorganized on the corner of his desk. She left the blinds open when he preferred them drawn. Each time, she watched from the periphery, waiting for the shift in his demeanor, waiting for the cold, calculated anger she had been warned about. It never came. He simply adjusted the memos himself. He pulled the blinds down with a steady, unhurried motion. There was no sigh of frustration, no sharp comment, no flicker of annoyance in his eyes. The man who had once been described as a machine of pure efficiency was acting with a strange, quiet tolerance that defied every rumor she had heard. She was no longer just an employee waiting for the end. She was a witness to a man who seemed to be holding back a tide, and she was the only one who could see the cracks in the dam. The office was empty, save for the low hum of the vending machine in the corner of the break room. Alice walked in, intending to finish a report, but stopped dead in the doorway. The lights were dimmed to a dull, flickering yellow. Min-jae was sitting at the small table, his back to the entrance. He was not working. He was not reviewing files. His hands rested on the table, and they were shaking with a rhythmic, violent tremor. Between his fingers lay a small, faded photograph. He stared at it, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped in a way that made him look smaller than he ever had in the boardroom. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the mechanical drone of the cooling system. Alice took a half step back, her foot catching on the floor tile, but he did not turn. He was entirely lost to the image in his hands. She watched the way his knuckles turned white as he gripped the edge of the paper, his breathing shallow and uneven. This was not the man who commanded boardrooms or navigated hostile takeovers. This was a person unraveling in the dark. The photograph seemed to be the anchor for a pain he had been carrying. Alice stayed in the shadow of the doorframe for a long heartbeat, her pulse thrumming in her ears. Every professional instinct told her to turn around, to walk away, and to pretend she had never seen the tremor in his hands. But the sight of him, so completely undone, anchored her to the spot. She took a breath, stepped into the light, and moved toward the small kitchenette. The sound of the kettle clicking on felt deafening in the quiet room. She moved with exaggerated care, measuring the tea leaves, pouring the water, and letting the steam rise between them. She did not look at him, but she felt the weight of his presence, a static charge in the air. She walked to the table, her footsteps soft against the linoleum. She set the cup down near his hand, the ceramic clinking against the wood with a sharp, final sound. He did not move, but his breathing hitched. Alice pulled out the chair opposite him. She sat down, keeping her movements slow and deliberate, signaling that she was not there to judge or to report. She folded her hands on the table, mirroring his posture, and waited. The silence stretched, no longer cold or distant, but heavy with the unspoken acknowledgement of his vulnerability. The tea sent a thin ribbon of steam into the air, curling between them. Min-jae did not look up. Please, don't forget to kindly subscribe and share this channel. It goes a long way for us. His gaze remained fixed on the photograph, his jaw locked tight against the urge to speak. Alice watched the way his fingers twitched against the table's surface. She leaned forward, the wood of the chair groaning. She did not offer a platitude. She did not try to fix the situation. She simply let the words fall into the space between them. "It is okay to miss them," she whispered. The sound was barely a ripple in the quiet room. Min-jae flinched. The tremor in his hands stopped instantly, replaced by a rigid, unnatural stillness. Alice did not pull back. She held her ground, her gaze steady on the side of his face. He took a long, ragged breath, and for the first time, he did not reach for his mask. The air in the break room seemed to thin as Min-jae finally turned his head. His eyes, usually sharp enough to cut, were clouded with a fatigue he had spent years trying to bury. He looked at Alice not as a subordinate, but as a person who had witnessed the impossible. The rigid line of his mouth wavered. He tried to reclaim his composure, his hand reaching out to push the photograph away, but his fingers faltered halfway across the table. He let his hand drop. The silence was no longer a weapon he wielded. It was a space he was finally willing to share. He slumped, the tension draining from his shoulders in a single, visible exhale. The cold, calculated distance he maintained between himself and the world flickered and died. He looked at the tea, then back at Alice, his gaze lingering on her face with a strange, searching quality. He was no longer looking for a mistake to correct or a task to assign. He was looking for a reason to stop fighting. His breathing slowed, matching the steady rhythm of her own. The mask had not just cracked, it had fallen away entirely, leaving him exposed in the dim light. He opened his mouth, his voice catching in his throat, and for the first time, he did not reach for a defensive remark. He simply waited for the words to come. He spoke, and his voice was a low, jagged sound that barely carried across the table. He did not look at her, but instead traced the edge of the photograph with a trembling thumb. He described a boardroom much like the one he now commanded, but filled with different faces. He told her about his mother, the way she had built the foundation of the firm from nothing, only to be systematically dismantled by the board. He recounted the day they stripped her of her title and forced her out, leaving her with nothing but the silence of an empty office. He watched the memory play out in his mind, his jaw tightening as he recalled the cold precision of their betrayal. He explained that he had hardened his heart not out of malice, but out of a desperate, clawing fear. He finally looked up, his eyes searching hers for the judgment he had expected for a decade. Alice did not flinch. She did not offer empty platitudes or professional condolences. She simply reached across the table and placed her hand near his, not touching, but close enough to bridge the distance he had spent years enforcing. The silence that followed was no longer heavy with the threat of termination. It was weighted with the gravity of shared truth. Min-jae watched her hand, then her face, searching for the pity he had grown to despise. He found none. Instead, he saw a steady, calm resolve that matched his own exhaustion. She stood up, walked to the small counter, and poured a second cup of tea, setting it firmly in front of him. The steam rose in the quiet air, curling between them. She sat back down, leaning into the table, and looked him directly in the eyes. The hierarchy that had defined every interaction simply vanished. He took a breath, the first deep, unforced inhalation he had managed in weeks. He picked up the cup, and for the first time in his life, he did not look away. The following morning, the office felt different. The air was no longer sharp with the threat of sudden outbursts. Min-jae sat at his desk, but he was not staring at the monitor with his usual intensity. He found himself pausing, his pen hovering over a document, as he listened to the rhythm of footsteps outside his door. When Alice entered to place a stack of files on his desk, he did not immediately return to his screen. He looked up. He watched her set the papers down, noticing the way she moved with a newfound, quiet confidence. There was no hesitation in her hands. He caught her eye, and for a fleeting second, he did not look away. He offered a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Later that afternoon, when a meeting ran long, he did not bark orders at her. He simply caught her gaze across the table. He was no longer a machine operating in a vacuum. He was a man who had finally allowed the walls to lower. The change in the office did not go unnoticed for long. It started in the break room, where the usual silence was replaced by hushed conversations near the coffee machine. Employees who had spent years walking on eggshells found themselves pausing, watching the CEO move through the halls with a pace that was no longer frantic. When Min-jae entered the main floor, the air did not grow cold. He stopped to ask a junior analyst about a project, listening to the answer without checking his watch. The staff whispered. They wondered if the pressure had finally broken him or if something else had taken root. These rumors traveled fast, rising through the floors like smoke. By the end of the week, the board members had caught wind of the shift. They did not see a man becoming more human. They saw a leader losing his edge. In the high-level meetings, the directors exchanged sharp glances whenever Min-jae deferred to Alice or showed a moment of uncharacteristic patience. They began to track his movements, logging every instance where his focus drifted from the bottom line. The boardroom, once a place of absolute control, became a theater of scrutiny. They sat in their leather chairs, watching the monitors, waiting for the first sign that this new softness would lead to a mistake. They were hunting for a weakness in the man who had once been untouchable. The board members met in a windowless room, the walls lined with data points and performance charts. They had spent hours reviewing the logs of the past month. The conclusion was unanimous. They did not care about the improved morale or the steady workflow. They cared about the shift in Min-jae's focus. They pulled up the security footage, isolating every moment where he paused to speak with Alice. They watched the way he lowered his guard, the way he deferred to her judgment, and the way his eyes tracked her movement across the office. To them, this was not growth, it was a malfunction. They pointed to the screen, tracing the pattern of his behavior like a surgeon identifying a tumor. They labeled his connection to her as a dangerous emotional instability. It was a leverage point, a crack in the armor they had been waiting years to find. One director leaned forward, tapping the image of Alice on the monitor. He argued that a man who could be swayed by a single person was a man who could no longer be trusted. They were not looking for a way to improve the company. They were looking for the exact mechanism to break him. The target was set. They prepared to strike. The board convened in a private suite, far from the prying eyes of the staff. The doors were locked, and the digital security was engaged. They moved with the precision of a military unit, laying out the documents that would dismantle Min Jae's authority. They drafted the terms of a hostile takeover, ensuring every clause was designed to corner him. The core of their strategy was simple: force a public choice. They wrote the ultimatum in clear, uncompromising language. Min Jae would be required to terminate Alice immediately, citing her presence as a breach of professional conduct. If he refused, they would trigger a vote of no confidence, leveraging his recent behavioral shifts as proof of his instability. They debated the timing, deciding to strike when he was most vulnerable, during the upcoming quarterly review. They reviewed the signatures needed to freeze his assets and strip his voting rights. Every word on the page was a weapon, crafted to isolate him and break his resolve. They finalized the document, the ink dark and permanent. They had built a cage, and now they only needed to wait for him to walk inside. The morning began with a sharp, rhythmic knock at the office door. It was not the usual assistant, but a courier with a heavy, wax-sealed envelope. He placed it on the mahogany desk and retreated without a word, his footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet of the room. Min Jae stared at the envelope for a long moment before his fingers broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of thick, cream-colored paper. It was a formal summons to an emergency board meeting, scheduled for the following dawn. The agenda was intentionally sparse, consisting of only 3 words: review of corporate governance. Below the text, the signatures of the board members were crowded together, a visual reminder of the coalition forming against him. Min Jae read the document twice, his eyes scanning the lines for any hint of their specific intent. There was none. The vagueness was the threat itself. He set the paper down, but his hand lingered on the edge of the desk. The air in the room felt colder, the silence heavier. He stood up, walked to the window, and watched the horizon, waiting for the light to fade. Alice entered the office with the morning files, but the usual rhythm of the room was broken. Min Jae stood by the desk, his back to the door, his posture rigid as if he were bracing for an impact. She stopped, the papers held tight against her chest. He did not turn around, even when she cleared her throat. She stepped forward, placing the documents on the edge of the mahogany surface, but his eyes remained fixed on the wall ahead. When he finally shifted, his movements were jagged, lacking their usual precision. He reached for a glass of water, his hand hovering for a second, before he gripped it with enough force to turn his knuckles white. Alice watched him, her pulse quickening. She realized then that the summons on his desk had changed everything. She felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach, a sudden, sharp fear. She backed away toward the door, her footsteps silent on the rug. He didn't notice her leave. He was already lost in the calculation of a war. The rain lashed against the glass, blurring the city lights into streaks of cold, white light. Min Jae stood motionless, his forehead resting against the cool surface of the window. Below, the streets were veins of movement, a chaotic network he had spent years mastering. He looked at his own reflection, faint and ghost-like against the dark backdrop of the storm. For the first time, the empire he had built felt like a cage. He traced the outline of a skyscraper with his fingertip, thinking of the board members waiting in the room down the hall. They wanted a machine, a leader without pulse or memory. He shifted his weight, the floorboards beneath him silent. He thought of the tea on his desk, the small, quiet moments that had forced him to look at the world differently. If he kept the company, he would have to discard the only person who had ever seen him as a human being. If he kept his humanity, he would lose the power. The hesitation vanished. He turned away from the rain, his movements deliberate and calm, ready to walk toward the door. Min Jae stepped out of his office, the heavy door clicking shut behind him with a finality that echoed down the corridor. The hallway stretched ahead, a long, sterile tunnel of polished stone and recessed lighting. He began to walk. His footsteps were measured, rhythmic, and unnervingly loud in the empty space. Every stride felt heavier than the last, as if the building itself were trying to hold him back. He passed the rows of glass-walled offices where he had spent years dictating the terms of his success. They were dark now, the occupants long gone, leaving behind only the faint hum of servers and the smell of ozone. He didn't look left or right. He kept his gaze fixed on the double doors at the end of the hall. He reached out to touch the wall, his fingertips brushing the cold, smooth surface, feeling the vibration of the city deep within the structure. He was walking away from the life he had forged, step by deliberate step. He stood perfectly still, his chest rising and falling in a slow, controlled cadence. He took one final breath, reached for the heavy brass handles. The double doors swung open, revealing the boardroom in a state of absolute, calculated stillness. The long table was occupied by 12 figures, each seated with their hands folded, eyes fixed on the entrance. The air inside was stagnant, heavy with the scent of bitter coffee and the faint metallic tang of ozone from the ventilation system. Please, don't forget to kindly subscribe and share this channel. Min-jae stepped into the room, the sound of his shoes on the polished floor sharp and intrusive. Not a single person moved. The board members sat in a perfect, unbroken row, their faces masks of cold, professional indifference. They did not greet him. They simply watched, a collective wall of judgment that seemed to shrink the space between them. Min-jae walked toward the head of the table, his gaze sweeping across the faces of those who had once been his allies. He sat down, his back straight, his hands resting on the cool surface of the mahogany. He was surrounded. The silence held for a long count of 10. Min-jae kept his hands flat on the table, his knuckles white against the dark grain of the wood. Across from him, the chairman shifted. He reached into a leather folder and withdrew a stack of heavy, cream-colored pages. With a slow, deliberate motion, he pushed the document across the polished mahogany. It glided over the surface, the faint rasp of paper against wood sounding like a gunshot. The pages came to a stop inches from Min-jae's fingers. He did not touch them. He looked down at the text, the ink sharp and black against the stark white. The document was thick, bound by a single metal clip that caught the overhead light. It detailed the exact terms of the severance. The words were clinical, stripping away his authority and demanding the immediate termination of his assistant. The chairman leaned back, his chair creaking. He watched Min-jae's reaction, his eyes unblinking. Min-jae felt the cold air from the vents hit his face, but he did not look up. He remained motionless, the contract lying between them like a final, irrevocable choice. The lead director stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate, and calculated to draw every eye in the room. He walked around the table, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic, until he stopped directly behind Min-jae. He leaned down, his face hovering just inches from Min-jae's shoulder. He did not speak at first. He simply tapped his finger against the mahogany table, a steady, maddening beat that echoed through the room. "You are holding on to a ghost, Min-jae," the director said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "If you refuse to sign, this company will not just replace you, we will erase you." He gestured toward the windows, where the city lights flickered. "You will be a name in a file, a footnote in a history book that no one reads. Your bank accounts will be frozen, your reputation dismantled, and your access to every boardroom in this city will be permanently revoked. You will have nothing, no office, no power, no legacy. Sign the paper or watch everything you have built turn to ash by morning. This is not a request, Min-jae. It is your final warning." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Min-jae remained motionless, his eyes fixed on the grain of the wood. The silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy with the weight of the director's words. Outside, the city lights continued their indifferent pulse, but inside, time seemed to grind to a halt. Min-jae's breath was shallow, controlled, as he calculated the cost of every possible move. He felt the gaze of the board members pressing against his back, waiting for a sign of collapse. Then, a sound broke the stillness. It was faint, the metallic click of a door handle turning, followed by the slow, deliberate groan of heavy hinges. The boardroom door, which had been pulled shut to ensure total isolation, began to yield. It swung inward, just a few inches at first, creating a narrow sliver of light from the hallway. Through that gap, a figure appeared. It was Alice. She stood in the hallway, her expression one of quiet concern, her hand still resting on the doorframe. She did not look at the board members. She was looking directly into the room, searching for Min-jae. Min-jae turned his head. The movement felt slow, as if the air in the room had turned to water. His gaze cut across the mahogany table, past the hostile faces of the board members, and landed directly on Alice. She stood in the sliver of light, her brow furrowed with a simple, honest worry that had nothing to do with stocks. The sound of the board members arguing began to fade, dropping away into a dull, distant hum. Min-jae locked eyes with her. In that brief, silent exchange, the cold logic he had spent years constructing began to fracture. His pulse suddenly hammered against his ribs. He felt the contract beneath his hand, the paper rough and biting against his skin. He was no longer looking at a secretary or a pawn. He was looking at the only person who had ever seen him as a human being. Min-jae held her gaze, and for the first time in his career, he understood exactly what he was about to lose. The chairman pushed a heavy fountain pen across the polished surface. It slid with a sharp, rhythmic scrape, coming to a stop inches from the contract. The sound seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Min-jae did not look at the pen. He kept his focus on Alice, who remained motionless in the doorway, her presence a silent anchor in the middle of the storm. The board members leaned forward, their faces tight with anticipation, their breathing synchronized in a predatory rhythm. Min-jae felt the cold air from the ventilation system prickling his skin. He slowly shifted his gaze from Alice to the document. The ink on the paper was dark, stark against the white background, representing the end of everything he had built for her. His hand moved toward the pen. His fingers twitched, hovering just millimeters above the smooth, cool metal. The room fell into a state of absolute stillness. Not a chair creaked, not a paper rustled. The only sound was the faint, steady ticking of the wall clock, each second stretching into an eternity. Min-jae's palm hovered over the desk, his muscles coiled, his skin damp with the effort of the decision. He was suspended in the gap between his past and his future. The pen sat there, a cold metallic weight on the mahogany. Min-jae's fingers were inches away, poised to sign away the only person who had ever looked at him without wanting something in return. The silence in the room was absolute, a physical pressure that pushed against his eardrums. Then, the air shifted. A sudden, sharp clarity cut through the haze of the boardroom. He looked at his own hand, trembling in the air, and saw it not as a tool for business, but as a weapon he was about to turn against himself. The realization hit like a physical jolt. He pulled his hand back, snapping it away from the desk as if the pen were searing his skin. The movement was sudden, violent, and final. He straightened his spine, the chair legs scraping harshly against the floor as he stood up. His jaw locked, the muscles along his cheekbones tightening until they ached. He didn't look at the chairman. He didn't look at the contract. He stared straight ahead, his breathing slowing, his pulse evening out into a steady, rhythmic thrum. Min-jae stood rigid, his head held high, his gaze turning from the document to the room at large. He was no longer the man who bowed to pressure. The silence held, thick and suffocating, until Min-jae moved. He reached down, his fingers closing around the edges of the contract. The paper crinkled, a sharp, dry sound that cut through the room like a blade. He pulled the document toward him, the friction of the paper against the mahogany table sounding like a warning. He gripped it with both hands, his knuckles turning white. As he held the weight of his future between his palms, the board members watched, their mouths slightly open, their expectations shattered by the simple, deliberate motion of his hands. He did not look at the text. He did not look at the signatures. He looked only at the paper, feeling the texture of the document that had been designed to destroy his life. He held it steady, his grip firm, his pulse steadying with every second he kept it away from the pen. The air in the room seemed to thin, the oxygen replaced by the tension of his defiance. He stood there, a pillar of immovable intent, holding the contract as if it were the only thing keeping the world from collapsing. His fingers tightened, the paper resisting for a heartbeat before it gave way. A sharp, jagged rip echoed through the boardroom, the sound of 1,000 promises snapping at once. He pulled his hands apart, the document splitting cleanly down the center. He didn't stop there. He folded the halves and tore them again, the sound rhythmic and cold. He let the pieces flutter from his fingers, watching them drift down to settle on the polished mahogany like fallen leaves. The board members surged forward, voices rising in a chaotic swell, but he didn't hear them. He turned his back on the table, his boots clicking against the hard floor with a steady, measured pace. He reached the heavy oak doors, pushed them open, and stepped into the hallway without glancing back. The light from the corridor hit his face, bright and unfiltered. He kept walking, his stride lengthening as he moved toward the elevators. The door slid open, and he stepped inside, leaving the billions far behind. The office was small, filled with the hum of a single printer and the scent of fresh coffee. Min-jae sat at a desk covered in handwritten notes, his pen moving across the page with purpose. Across the room, Alice sorted through a stack of client files, her movements quick and purposeful. She reached for a binder, caught her foot on the corner of the rug, and stumbled. Min-jae was up before she hit the floor, his hand steadying her arm. They shared a brief, knowing look, then returned to their work. The billions were gone, but the pressure had vanished with them. They spent their days solving problems for others, building a business that relied on trust rather than fear. Every evening, they closed the office door together, the weight of the past replaced by the momentum of their shared goals. They had learned that the most significant risks were the ones they were once afraid to take. The sun dipped below the skyline, casting long, amber shadows across the floor. Min-jae leaned back, watching the city pulse with life, his focus shifting from the screen to the woman working quietly nearby. He remembered the day they met, the spilled coffee, and the terror in her eyes. It felt like a lifetime ago. Alice looked up, catching his gaze, and offered a small, knowing smile. She didn't look away. She didn't tremble. She simply stood, walked over to the window, and stood beside him. They had built this space from nothing, brick by brick, mistake by mistake. The fear that once dictated their every move had been replaced by a quiet, steady resolve. Min-jae reached out, resting his hand on the frame, his movements relaxed and deliberate. They were partners in every sense. They turned away from the glass, back toward the desk, ready to face whatever came next. The journey had been long. The office lights dimmed as they prepared to leave for the night. Min-jae gathered the last of the project files, sliding them into the drawer with a steady hand. Alice checked the windows, ensuring the locks were secure, her movements precise and calm. They had come a long way from the chaos of their first encounter. The lessons learned in the boardroom were now the bedrock of their consultancy. They walked toward the exit, the sound of their footsteps echoing against the quiet walls. Min-jae paused at the door, reaching for the light switch, his hand lingering for a moment before he flicked it down. Darkness settled over the room, but the sense of purpose remained. They stepped out into the hallway, the cool air of the evening greeting them. There was no looking back, no lingering regret for the life left behind. They had traded a hollow legacy for a life built on genuine connection and mutual support. As they walked toward the elevator, they spoke of the next day, their voices low and synchronized. They were no longer running from anything. The doors slid shut, leaving the past behind, and they began the descent, ready for the world waiting outside. Their journey was complete, yet the real work was only just beginning. They emerged from the lobby and onto the pavement. The city air was sharp, carrying the scent of rain and distant traffic. Min-jae stopped for a moment, looking up at the towering glass structure that had once been his entire world. It looked smaller from the outside. Alice stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the city lights bled into the dark sky. They did not speak. The silence between them was no longer heavy, but comfortable. It was the silence of two people who had nothing left to prove. Min-jae took a breath, the cold air filling his lungs, and turned his back on the building. He started walking, his pace steady and unhurried. Alice matched his stride, her hand brushing against his arm as they moved together. They passed the streetlights, their shadows stretching and merging on the concrete. The noise of the city rose to meet them, a chaotic rhythm they no longer feared. They were not just partners in business, but architects of a life they had chosen. They reached the corner and turned, disappearing into the flow of the crowd. The past was a closed chapter, and the road ahead was theirs to define. The horizon began to shift, a faint line of amber light cutting through the deep indigo of the pre-dawn sky. They reached a quiet park bench overlooking the river, the water reflecting the waking city. Min-jae sat down, his posture relaxed, his hands resting on his knees. Alice joined him, watching the light spread across the surface of the water. They had spent years chasing a version of success that demanded they leave their humanity behind. Now, sitting in the stillness, the irony was clear. The mistakes they had once feared, the spilled coffee, the missed deadlines, had been the very things that saved them. Min-jae turned to Alice, a subtle nod acknowledging the path they had walked together. There was no need for grand declarations. They stood up as the sun cleared the skyline, casting long, warm rays across the path ahead. They walked toward the light, leaving the shadows of the boardroom far behind. They moved forward, two people who had found their way home in each other. They reached the entrance of their own small office, a space filled with the scent of fresh paint and possibility. Min-jae unlocked the door, the metal key turning with a sharp, satisfying click. As they stepped inside, Alice stumbled over the threshold. Min-jae reached out, his hand steadying her arm before she could lose her balance. They both paused, the silence filled by a sudden, genuine laugh. It was a reminder of how they had started, yet everything felt different now. The office was humble, with stacks of paper on a simple wooden desk, but it was theirs. Min-jae walked to the window and pushed it open, letting the morning air circulate through the room. Alice began organizing the files, her movements purposeful and calm. They moved around each other with an ease born of shared history and mutual respect. There were no boards to answer to, no secrets to guard, and no mask to wear. They sat down at the desk, the light of the full day pouring in around them. They picked up their pens, ready to build something that mattered. The journey had led them here, to a place where mistakes were welcomed as lessons. They started their work, the sound of their voices blending into the quiet rhythm of a new beginning. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, soft shadows across the desk. Min-jae closed the final ledger of the day, the sound echoing in the quiet room. He leaned back, his gaze lingering on the stacks of paper that represented their collective effort. Alice stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker to life. One by one, they had arrived at a place where the weight of the past no longer dictated the rhythm of their lives. Every decision they made now was their own, unburdened by the expectations of others. Min-jae stood up and walked toward her, his movements steady and deliberate. He stopped beside her, and they watched the city together, two people who had found clarity in the wreckage of their former lives. The path they had taken was not easy, but it was theirs. They had learned that the most significant changes often begin with a single, imperfect step. As the darkness settled outside, they turned away from the window, ready to leave the office behind for the night. They had built something lasting, not out of perfection, but out of the courage to be human. The door clicked shut, sealing the day. The streets were quiet, the rush of the city muffled by the late hour. They walked side by side, their footsteps rhythmic against the pavement. Min-jae kept his pace steady, his hands deep in his pockets, while Alice navigated the uneven sidewalk with a newfound confidence. They passed the towering glass building where they had first met, its lights cold and distant compared to the warmth of their own small office. Neither of them looked back. The weight of the boardroom, the hostile takeovers, and the endless demands had dissolved into the night air. They reached a corner and stopped, the intersection stretching out before them in every direction. It was a choice they made every single day, to keep moving forward, to build, and to remain human in a world that often demanded otherwise. Alice turned to him, a question in her eyes, and Min-jae nodded, a subtle shift in his expression that spoke of total clarity. They had found their own rhythm, one that didn't require permission or approval. As they turned the corner, the city swallowed their silhouettes. The city lights blurred into a soft glow as they continued their walk, the distance from their past measured not in miles, but in the quiet ease of their stride. They had reached a point where the noise of the world no longer dictated their pace. Min-jae paused at the edge of a park, watching the wind stir the leaves, a stark contrast to the sterile, climate-controlled boardrooms he once inhabited. Alice stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her presence a constant anchor. They had learned that the most beautiful destinies were not crafted in boardrooms or through cold, calculated precision, but were built on the very mistakes they were once too afraid to make. Every stumble, every spilled cup, every moment of vulnerability had been a brick in the foundation of their current life. They turned away from the park, their footsteps falling in unison. There was no need for grand declarations or further proof of their resolve. The partnership they had forged was its own testament. They moved forward into the night, two people who had traded the illusion of control for the reality of connection. The path ahead remained unmapped, but for the first time, they walked it with the certainty that they were exactly where they were meant to be. The story of their beginning had ended, and the life they had chosen was finally, truly, their own. The journey that began in a room filled with cold silence had reached its natural horizon. They stood together, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars, no longer tethered to the rigid expectations that once defined their existence. Every obstacle they had faced, every moment of uncertainty, had served to strip away the unnecessary, leaving only the core of their partnership. Min-jae looked at the path ahead, his movements fluid and unburdened, while Alice stood firm, her presence a testament to the resilience they had cultivated together. They had moved beyond the need for validation, finding strength in the very imperfections that had once been seen as failures. The consultancy they built was more than just a business. It was a sanctuary for the human spirit, a place where mistakes were not punished but understood. As they walked toward the final light of the evening, they carried the weight of their history with grace, knowing that the most profound victories are those won in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. They had arrived at a place of true belonging, not by seeking perfection, but by embracing the messy, unpredictable reality of being human. The echoes of the boardroom had long since faded, replaced by the steady, rhythmic hum of their own shared workspace. Every morning brought the same quiet clarity. They worked side by side, not as master and subordinate, but as architects of a life built on mutual trust. When a document was misplaced or a deadline loomed, there was no panic, only the calm exchange of ideas and the shared understanding that their strength lay in their combined perspective. They had learned to value the process over the outcome, finding that the most meaningful work was done in the moments of collaboration that required patience and grace. Their consultancy grew, not through aggressive tactics, but through the genuine connection they fostered with everyone they encountered. They remained grounded, tethered to the reality that their success was a direct result of the risks they had taken together. As the sun set on another day of progress, they looked back at the distance they had traveled, not with regret, but with the quiet satisfaction of two people who had found their true purpose. The legacy they were building was not measured in wealth or status, but in the lives they touched. They stood at the threshold of a future they had created with their own hands, ready to face whatever came next with the unwavering confidence of a partnership. The final chapter of their transformation was not written in grand gestures, but in the small, consistent acts of support that defined their days. They had moved beyond the shadows of their past, finding stability in the simple rhythm of their shared goals. Every challenge they encountered now was met with the same steady resolve that had carried them through the collapse of their former lives. They understood that the strength of their partnership was not in the absence of mistakes, but in the willingness to catch one another when the ground shifted. As they looked toward the horizon, they carried the lessons of their journey as a compass, guiding them through the complexities of a world that no longer demanded their conformity. Their consultancy stood as a testament to the belief that true success is found in the courage to remain human in the face of cold ambition. They had built a foundation that could withstand the pressures of time, anchored by the trust they had forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. The path ahead was clear, a testament to the fact that the most beautiful destinies are those we choose to build for ourselves. They walked forward into the quiet promise of the future. The journey had come full circle. What began in a cold, rigid boardroom had blossomed into a life defined by warmth and genuine connection. They understood now that the mistakes of the past were not failures, but the essential stones upon which their current reality was built. Every stumble, every spilled cup, and every moment of doubt had served a purpose, stripping away the armor they once thought necessary to survive. They moved through their days with a lightness that had been impossible before, anchored by the knowledge that they were no longer alone in their endeavors. The legacy they left behind was not one of power, but of the courage to change. They had proven that the most rigid structures could be dismantled. As they stood together, looking toward the horizon, they knew the path ahead was theirs to define. They had found their way back to themselves. Their story remained a quiet testament to the fact that when we stop running from our vulnerabilities, we finally become free to create something that lasts. Please, don't forget to kindly subscribe